Hi, my name is Lydia Quella, and I am presenting my applied nutrition capstone thesis titled Evaluating School-Based Nutrition Education Interventions Targeting Fruit and Vegetable Intake, a Systematic Review. I have a Bachelor of Science in Dietetics from Michigan State University. I then went on to complete my dietetic internship at Prairie View A&M University, and currently I'm an MSAN graduate candidate at the University of New England, August 2020. My work experience primarily lies within clinical nutrition and dietetics. To outline today's presentation, we're going to start with a research question and move into the background, aim and objectives, methods, results, discussion, limitations, and finish with future research and implications and conclusion. The research question in PICO format is: do elementary children that participate in theory-based nutrition education in a school setting increase fruit and vegetable consumption compared to elementary children that do not? The prevalence of childhood obesity worldwide has significantly increased over the last decade. In 2016, an estimated 41 million children under the age of 5 were overweight. This is concerning, as children that are overweight or obese are likely to stay obese into adulthood, increasing the risk for the development of chronic diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease at a younger age. Overweight and obesity and related diseases are preventable. Thus, establishing healthy eating behaviors early in life is important. Evidence shows that eating habits and patterns track into adulthood. Therefore, childhood is a time where education about healthy eating is essential to health-promoting behaviors. Fruits and vegetables are typically lower-calorie, nutrient-dense foods considered to be critical components of healthful diets. Depending on age and gender and level of physical activity, it is recommended that children 2 to 18 years old consume 1 to 2 cups of fruit and 1 to 3 cups of vegetables daily. Despite the potential to improve overall health, daily intake of fruit and vegetables for children across all ages remains well below the recommended levels. Meeting fruit and vegetable intake recommendations is important for children's health now and in the future. Although nutrition education to enhance healthy eating is challenging, several theoretical perspectives have been applied to explaining and influencing health behaviors of individuals, including nutrition behavior. The use of theory-based approaches is recommended and used in program planning to understand and explain health behavior and to guide the identification, development, and implementation of interventions. Behavior-based interventions that apply health behavior theories or constructs have established success and are recommended for improving dietary behaviors. Theory provides a framework for developing interventions focused on factors that influence a specific behavior, such as fruit and vegetable intake. Listed here are the common theoretical models and constructs used in this review. A 2011 review of randomized controlled trial reported on the efficacy of behavior-related interventions to enhance fruit and vegetable intake. Of the 7 studies conducted in children, 4 indicated an increase in intake in servings per day, but a significant increase in fruit and vegetable intake was only demonstrated in 3 of the studies, with an average increase in intake of 0.39 servings per day above the control. This review noted that changing dietary behavior for children, substantial changes in approach will be necessary to reach adequate amounts of fruit and vegetable intake on a regular basis. Later, a 2014 review identified 29 behavioral theory studies that measured fruit and vegetable intake among children with targeted dietary change. This review found increases in fruit and vegetable intake had small to modest improvements in outcome effectiveness, with a p less than 0.011. Consistent with the 2011 review, the effect on fruit and vegetable intake was stronger when the interventions were theory-based. Similar but fewer substantial changes were exhibited, with the differences in mean between theory and non-theory interventions was 0.333 for fruit and vegetable intake. From the currently available literature, it is evident significant changes in health behavior are required in children to meet recommended daily fruit and vegetable intake. It is important to evaluate school nutrition education programs intended to increase fruit and vegetable consumption and their efficacy. Previous systematic reviews that have focused on school program impacts on increased fruit and vegetable consumption have reported modest increases of less than one portion of fruit and vegetables a day. Many of these reviews include overview of multiple intervention objectives targeting education, gardening, dietary habits, physical activity, and/or weight as opposed to fruit and vegetable intake alone. Even though a modest increase in fruit and vegetable consumption was noted, improvements in behavior determinants and overall healthier diet choices illustrates the importance of diet at a young age. Assessment of nutrition education that includes health behavior theories can determine the most successful interventions to build future programs. The aim of this paper is to systematically review the evidence related to nutrition education theory-based interventions and the impacts on fruit and vegetable consumption in elementary-aged children in a school setting. The first objective is to describe the interventions that have been conducted, like the theories and strategies and approaches. The second objective is to determine the efficacy of these interventions. Further, this systematic review will identify limitations in behavior-based study designs in order to suggest future directions for research and health promotion efforts targeting increased fruit and vegetable intake in the school setting of K through 8th grade. This systematic review was conducted based on current recommendations of the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis approach in reporting the evidence in a specific topic area. Articles that focused on studies that conducted elementary or school-based nutrition education using theory-based interventions on dietary behaviors were identified by performing a literature search in Scopus, ProQuest, and Summons. The initial limits set were to only include human, published in English, peer-reviewed journal articles with publication dates between 2010 and 2020. The following search terms were used: elementary students or youth, dietary intake or diet quality, education or program, or nutrition education, dietary behavior, and school intervention. All eligible studies were in the form of a randomized controlled trial, quasi-experimental, cluster randomized trial, and non-controlled trial design. Excluded were reviews, non-intervention studies, cross-sectional and qualitative studies, abstracted or oral abstract data, and gray literature. The following study criteria were applied as inclusion criteria. Elementary age students for the purpose of this review is defined between ages 4 to 13 years old. Explicit measure of fruit and vegetable consumption and clear use of a theory or model as the framework of the intervention. In addition, studies were identified through other sources, such as checking through the reference list of relevant studies, searching references from relevant papers, and cross-references. Studies with interventions targeting single and multiple components and outcomes were included for review. However, this review only reports on the outcomes of interest. Here is the PRISMA flowchart diagram. The process by which the studies were included in this review: a total of 1,938 references were identified from databases. Of these, 1,583 were excluded as they did not meet all the inclusion criteria, or they were not relevant, either because they considered other types of interventions or were not school-based programs. After removal of 27 duplicates, a total of 335 unique articles were identified. Titles and abstracts were independently reviewed, leading to the exclusion of 280 articles due to the criteria or because they were review, editorial, or method papers. 36 articles that did not use behavioral theory as a basis of the intervention, measure fruit and vegetable consumption as an outcome, or study populations used were children with health conditions such as eating disorders, diabetes, hospitalization, etc., were excluded, thus yielding a total of 19 articles for review. To abstract details from each study, a data extraction tool evidence worksheet from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence Analysis Manual was used for each article. In this review, determination of the quality of studies was guided by the Quality Criteria Checklist for Primary Research from A&D Evidence Analysis Manual. This included validity questions based on agency for healthcare research and quality domains for research studies, from systems to rate the strength of scientific evidence. A thorough assessment of the study's validity to address scientific soundness and recognize various threats that may undermine sound research that could lead to invalid conclusions. This resulted in each study receiving a score of positive, neutral, or negative. The primary analytic goal was to determine the efficacy of theory-based nutrition education interventions on fruit and vegetable consumption in elementary school-aged children. The outcome of each study was compared to the purpose or objectives to determine if an intervention was successful. Once validated, the contributing factors that were assessed included study design, intervention or program type, intervention implementation method, duration details of the intervention, and the use of theory in guiding the intervention. To summarize findings from nutrition education interventions, a semi-quantitative approach was used. To allow for a diverse range of reported statistics, outcomes, and measurements, results of the nutrition education interventions were determined to be successful throughout this review based on whether they reported a statistically significant change in fruit and/or vegetable intake from baseline or between group differences. Overall, 10 studies demonstrated a significant increase in fruit and/or vegetable consumption as a result of the intervention compared to the control groups, indicating a successful intervention effect, and 9 studies did not report significant increases in fruit and vegetable consumption. A summary of result description as depicted in this pie chart shows studies that did not report a significant intervention effect for either fruit and/or vegetable intake, but rather reported a significant increase in knowledge, attitude, or preference from baseline, which indicates positive impact towards behavior change. A total of 5 studies did not report significant findings for any related fruit and vegetable outcomes. However, 1 study reported an unexpected decrease in vegetable intake per day in the treatment group of 3.6%, which is smaller than the decrease in the control group of 26.4%, though other nutrition and health-related objectives were met. The outcome measures in studies with significant results. A total of 17 studies measured both fruit and vegetable intake, and 2 studies only measured fruit intake. Further significant increases were reported for both fruit and vegetable intake in 7 studies, and the remaining 3 studies reported significant increases in fruit intake only, as pictured here in this pie chart. The duration of intervention across the successful studies ranged between 13 days to 15 months, and does not appear to impact the efficacy of the interventions. A non-controlled trial of 180 participants assessed a dietary decision-making intervention in an elementary school cafeteria among K through 8th grade children that was grounded in social cognitive theory and operant learning theory, reported significant results in fruit with a p-value of less than 0.01 and vegetable with a p-value less than 0.05 consumption from baseline after just 13 days of intervention. Conversely, a cluster randomized trial of 297 participants examined the longitudinal effects of a school-based fruit and vegetable promotion program based on social cognitive theory among kindergarten and first grade children over a 15-month intervention duration, resulting in the experimental group consuming significantly more fruit with a p-value less than 0.001 and vegetables with a p-value less than 0.01 than the control group in year 1. Of all 19 studies reviewed, 3 studies with delayed post-intervention follow-up revealed sustained significant results of fruit and vegetable without regression towards baseline, suggesting sustained behavior change. This review included studies that had both individual and group interventions. A majority of studies used multi-component interventions, and 3 studies used single-component interventions. A multi-component intervention is the use of several different approaches to deliver nutrition education. 2 single-component studies evaluated the efficacy of a nutrition education intervention to increase fruit intake in elementary school-aged children. A randomized controlled trial of 464 participants examining the effects of a health promotion model and social cognitive theory-based dietary education intervention to increase fruit consumption in children aged 6 to 12 found significantly higher fruit intakes in the intervention group at lunch with a p-value equal 0.001 and at dinner a p-value of 0.012 when compared to the control group. Similarly, a 3-group randomized controlled trial with 218 participants investigated the efficacy of a social cognitive theory-based intervention for increasing school children's fruit intake and found significantly increased fruit intake in both intervention groups compared with the control group at the end of the intervention with a p-value less than 0.001. Conversely, a single-component randomized control trial with 98 participants assessed the impact of an intervention based on the health belief model to increase fruit and vegetable selection in second-grade children and found no significant differences between the intervention and control groups during or post-intervention. Delivery methods and activities were diverse across the studies, with the most common being classroom lessons and parent involvement. Other noted approaches were garden activities, cafeteria modifications or activities, physical activity, cooking demonstrations, taste testing, and homework. Each study had a unique combination of theories that were included in the program. The programs that resulted in significant increases in fruit and vegetable intake include 8 studies. Although engaging parents in the interventions was a common factor in both successful and unsuccessful interventions, half of the successful interventions were multi-component and engaged parents face-to-face. A quasi-experimental study of 717 participants evaluated the efficacy of a school-based fruit and vegetable co-op intervention grounded in social cognitive theory and theory of planned behavior on fruit and vegetable consumption. Results indicated statistically significant increases in fruit with 0.12 cups per day and a p-value of 0.046 and vegetables with 0.11 cups per day and a p-value of 0.049 intake among first grade participants compared to the control group. In contrast, multi-component studies that engaged parents remotely by providing website, homework, or newsletters did not report achieving their objectives. A quasi-experimental study of 127 participants that evaluated the impact of social cognitive theory-based nutrition education and garden interventions on fruit and vegetable consumption among 5th grade children only sent home newsletters and resulted in insignificant fruit or vegetable consumption, with a p-value of 0.22 and 0.23 respectively. Further, 4 unsuccessful single and multi-component studies did not engage parents at all. A quasi-experimental study of 104 participants of 3rd and 4th grade children incorporated a multi-component diet and physical activity intervention utilizing constructs from social cognitive theory for 12 weeks and did not result in an increased fruit and vegetable consumption. The approach of repeated opportunities, more exposure, and access to try fruit and vegetables through taste testing, cooking demonstrations, and gardening activities were used in 6 studies and does not appear to be predictive of success. In particular, all interventions reviewed that included gardening activities were multi-component and did not significantly increase fruit and vegetable intake. For instance, a randomized control trial of 566 participants evaluated the efficacy of a multi-component school-based nutrition intervention based on social cognitive theory and social ecological model among fourth grade students. Results showed significant improvements in knowledge with a p-value of 0.001 and total vegetable identification with a p-value less than 0.001 in the intervention group compared to the control group, but did not result in significant improvement in fruit and vegetable intake. In contrast, 3 studies that incorporated food tasting, cooking demonstrations, and access to fruit and vegetable did result in statistically significant increases in fruit and vegetable consumption. A randomized controlled trial of 535 participants, guided by social cognitive theory, tested the efficacy of a classroom nutrition education and fruit and vegetable taste testing intervention among third grade students and found significant increases in fruit and vegetable intake with a p-value less than 0.05 compared to nutrition education without taste testing participants along with the control group. The importance of adequately training the existing teachers or engaged nutrition experts in the implementation of the intervention as intended was prevalent among studies. A randomized controlled trial of 464 participants that examined the effects of a dietary nutrition education intervention based on health promotion model and social cognitive theory held 36 hours of professional development training for teachers and reported significantly higher intakes of fruit compared to the control at lunch with a p-value of 0.001 and dinner with a p-value of 0.012 after the intervention among 6 to 12-year-old children. However, accurate delivery of the intervention may be independent of adequate training. There were a few reported cases of lack of intervention fidelity that could have compromised the findings. A randomized control trial of 566 participants evaluated a school-based nutrition education intervention based on social cognitive theory and social ecological model, focused on improving children's dietary behaviors and prevention of childhood obesity. Reported one intervention school did not use the salad bar, held only one health fair, and did not allow cooking demonstrations to be conducted in the classroom. Although the intervention was the same by design and content information, results of the study varied among cohorts. As a result, the success of the intervention was affected by the lack of completion. Similarly, a randomized controlled trial of 675 participants investigated the efficacy of a school-based nutrition intervention grounded in social cognitive theory. Reported one school refused to deliver any of the intervention, and others did not deliver all of the lessons, regardless of the main intention to treat protocol, resulting in none of the primary outcomes differing between intervention and control groups. Explanations of how theory informed the development and application of interventions vary between studies, with several publications simply naming theories without listing key concepts or constructs or describing how or why they were directly incorporated. 7 studies were identified as theory-driven by using specific theory constructs in methodology, intervention, and assessment. Each included explanation of how integration of key concepts or constructs from the model was achieved and why this was anticipated to facilitate behavior change. A majority of the studies in this review were informed by theory, meaning they might identify the theory that informs their studies, but may not use all its constructs throughout the study. Of the theory-driven studies, 3 used a combination of theories, commonly social cognitive theory and theory of planned behavior, whereas the remaining studies utilized social cognitive theory only. Amongst all 7 studies, a total of 8 theoretical constructs were applied. Each of the studies explicitly used theory to select or develop intervention techniques. A quasi-experimental study of 665 participants that integrated social cognitive theory constructs of self-efficacy, outcome expectancy, and goal formation into classroom-based nutrition education and cafeteria interventions found self-efficacy to prepare fruit and vegetable at home demonstrated significant improvements with a p-value of 0.034. in the comprehensive intervention group compared to controls. However, only in a few studies, the effects of intervention on theory constructs were specifically measured and reported. For example, in a quasi-experimental study conducted among 5th grade children from 4 different elementary schools with 60 participants, found significant differences pre- and post-test were indicated in all psychosocial determinants for children, with a p of 0.000, except for perceived parental emotional support. Additionally, none of the interventions linked every theoretical construct proposed by a theory to an intervention technique. 7 studies not only examined whether the intervention increased fruit and vegetable intake, but also explored a change in theoretical constructs pre- and post-intervention. A limited number of studies demonstrated improvements in knowledge, self-efficacy, attitudes, and vegetable identification. A quasi-experimental study of 1,528 participants conducted among 3rd through 5th grade students employed a hybrid, school-based intervention based on social cognitive theory and theory of planned behavior. Findings resulted in a significant change of students' attitudes towards fruit and vegetables with a p-value of less than 0.05. Social cognitive theory was the most frequently cited framework amongst the reviewed interventions, including the 10 studies that reported significant increase in fruit and/or vegetable consumption. Behavioral capability and reinforcements were the major components of SCT used in most of the studies, along with self-efficacy in a few. Outcome expectancy, observational learning, and reciprocal determinism were also used as SCT constructs in multiple studies. Bandura's social cognitive theory is interpersonal theory that emphasizes mutual interactions of person behavior and environment. Accordingly, this theory proposes that environmental and personal characteristics influence behavior. Therefore, nutrition intervention studies often use principles of social cognitive theory to measure the ability to participate in beneficial nutrition behavior and explain how other variables, such as self-regulation and self-efficacy, are essential to integrating healthier nutrition into lifestyles. According to Bandura, nutrition interventions are most successful if they strengthen individuals' knowledge of the topic, such as understanding the benefits of a healthy diet, improve environmental factors, including family, peer, social support, encourage self-efficacy by fostering confidence in performing a specific behavior, develop the use of self-regulatory behaviors by means of modeling behavior and interactive learning, and interventions are appropriately tailored for demographic groups. Amongst the reviewed studies, 9 cite social cognitive theory as the only theoretical framework utilized. Further, 5 studies specify interventions based on all 3 social cognitive theory principal concepts of cognitive, individual, and environmental to increase fruit and vegetable intake. A randomized control study of 319 participants assessed the effects of a gardening, nutrition, and cooking intervention based on SCT constructs of motivation, self-efficacy, and behavioral capability among 3rd through 5th grade children. However, findings revealed no increases of fruit and vegetable intake among the intervention group compared to the controls. 10 studies found that participating in various school-based interventions was associated with significantly greater fruit and/or vegetable consumption. However, 9 other studies indicated no statistically significant changes in fruit and vegetable consumption. These results are consistent with previous school program reviews' modest impact on increases in fruit and vegetable consumption. Furthermore, minimal data regarding long-term changes in fruit and vegetable consumption has been collected, though 3 studies reviewed with delayed post-intervention follow-up found sustained significant results of fruit and vegetable intake over time. This suggests long-term benefits may be associated with implementing school-based behavioral theory nutrition education in elementary-aged children. However, the long term of such interventions largely remain in question. The duration of interventions provided varied among the studies. This suggests that duration of intervention does not affect efficacy. However, these results do not correspond to a systematic review that identified factors that contribute to effective nutrition education interventions in children, where dosage of 6 months or more was predictive of the success. However, most studies in this review investigated changes in consumption of both fruit and vegetables. although 2 studies reported examining fruit intake only, with significant increases in consumption. There is growing evidence that consumption of vegetables among children presents a much greater challenge than consumption of fruit. Additionally, the studies reviewed separated fruit and vegetable in general discussion and in actual measurement. This is beneficial as evidence suggests that nutrition-related interventions should target fruit and vegetables separately as a result of different factors influencing consumption, such as knowledge, barriers, and stages of change. Very few studies discuss results of servings of fruit and vegetable changes. Consequently, a direct comparison of study results was not possible in this review. Although results are not conclusive, it has been suggested that multi-component interventions may be more effective than single-component nutrition education interventions as they engage students on a variety of levels. Limited evidence also suggests that combining classroom nutrition education with a hands-on educational component may be particularly effective. This review found that nutrition education approaches with comprehensive multi-component interventions were more likely to achieve increased fruit and vegetable consumption. Further, a review by Van Kouwenberg et al. Confirms these findings, that multi-component interventions that include improved availability of fruit and vegetables, nutrition education curriculum delivered by teachers, and at least some parental involvement. Though a review by Marimi et al. Found that involved parents by in-person contact focused on specific behaviors to modify, assured fidelity by training the instructor. With the wide range of different components used throughout the reviewed studies, it becomes difficult to draw strong conclusions. A majority of studies in this review delivered nutrition education in classroom. However, 3 studies supplemented classroom lessons with increased exposure opportunities. When compared with children who did not receive an intervention and to those who received nutrition education only, the children who received increased exposure and nutrition education combined were found to have a greater increase in fruit and vegetable consumption over the intervention period. In this review, studies that had high fidelity were more likely to be successful. Of the interventions that were successful, trained existing teachers or engaged a professional in the implementation of the intervention. This confirms the findings of the review by Marimi et al. The results of this systematic review are consistent with previous theory-based behavior change reviews that indicated small, modest increases in fruit and vegetable consumption. In those that did report the impact, results were inconsistent with no specific construct to be associated with positive behavior change for increasing fruit and vegetable intake. Given the crossover between theoretical constructs and behavior change techniques, the positive results in this review may be a result of the individual behavior change techniques employed, rather than the theoretical constructs. Previous reviews have questioned the value of theory in developing and evaluating interventions, with 2 behavior change reviews concluding that interventions based on theory were no more effective than atheoretical interventions. Yet another 2 reviews that support the efficacy of theory-based interventions. The conflicting results may be due, at least in part, to the inadequate description of how theory is implemented and evaluated in the interventions. The results from studies presented in this review provide valuable insight. This systematic review and search results were conducted by and screened by only 1 reviewer, despite recommendations that eligibility screening is conducted by 2 independent reviewers. Also, 53% of the studies conducted randomization of their children or schools. Without randomization, researchers increased the risk for selection bias, systematic differences among the study groups, and less accurate interpretation of the effects of the intervention. Quasi-experimental and non-controlled study designs were used for the remaining studies, which have numerous limitations, including lack of randomization control groups, influence of confounding variables, threats to the internal validity, and overall weaker conclusions. Additionally, definition of the theory-based intervention was relatively broad and not limited by how well the theory was described or operationalized in the intervention. There was a lack of clear linkage between the behavior theories and or constructs used. Publications have detailed a checklist for evaluating this, which enables greater clarity in the role of theory in the development of an intervention and should be used for future studies. Further, almost every study used a variety of self-reported instruments to measure fruit and vegetable intake. Self-reported measurement tools are susceptible to social approval bias, therefore, may not accurately represent changes in dietary intake. Studies should consider including more objective measures, in addition to 24-hour recalls, to give a more complete picture of changes in consumption. For example, skin carotenoid levels can be assessed, which is in a non-invasive alternative to measure serum carotenoids that has been used as a valid objective indicator of fruit and vegetable consumption among children. While interventions reported a theoretical basis, these constructs were often inadequately discussed or reported. Due to the lack of linking constructs with behavior change, increasing fruit and vegetable intake, there remains a need to test whether changes in these constructs predict behavior change of increased fruit and vegetable intake in interventions. Further comparison between health theories would be a useful gap to address. There was little evidence to guide researchers in maintaining increased fruit and vegetable intake after completion of the interventions. The influence of environmental components on school-based nutrition education interventions on fruit and vegetable consumption in participating children would help the researchers understand the resulting fruit and vegetable consumption over the intervention period. Reviewing the effects of duration and intensity of the programs and the association with increased fruit and vegetable consumption can be beneficial in determining the most effective method for implementation. Furthermore, consideration for evidence-based curricula that are age-specific to the developmental stage of the intended audience should be examined. School-based nutrition education interventions based on theory demonstrate potential for improving fruit and vegetable intake in elementary-age children. Multi-component interventions demonstrate significance after a short intervention period. Improved description and reporting of intervention content and the way in which theory-based interventions use theory to guide the study and intervention components remain necessary to understand what factors are driving the result of theory-based interventions. Given the mixed findings of the efficacy of theory-based interventions, a greater understanding of how theory is operationalized is necessary to understand what factors contribute to the success of interventions. Research expanding the implementation and reporting of behavior change techniques is likely to improve the understanding of the working mechanisms that underpin how and why an intervention works or does not work. School-based nutrition education interventions that increase fruit and vegetable intake have been successfully implemented in developed countries, including the US, with an overall goal of improving health-related behaviors of children. Although the evidence is somewhat mixed, most available studies suggest a small but positive influence of nutrition education interventions on children's fruit and vegetable consumption. Although the use of theory did not determine the success of the interventions analyzed, it is important that interventions were based on theories and the constructs were mentioned. Recommendations for future research include investigating long-term changes in fruit and vegetable consumption, the influence of environmental components of nutrition education, school-based interventions on fruit and vegetable consumption in participating children, the effects of duration and intensity of programs, and the use of age-specific curricula on program outcomes, and the extent to which theoretical or behavior change constructs are implemented and evaluated to identify the successful components of the theoretical-based interventions. Here are my resources. Do we have any questions? Thank you.